Hi, and welcome to episode 91 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada.
I'm Heidi Parker. I'm a postdoc at the University of Texas at Austin.
I'm Tom Housley, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Exeter in Penryn.
And we're keeping up with Alt-October. We're getting deep into it now. Well, by the time you hear this, we'll be almost through October, but as of recording, we're still early. But lots of good stuff coming up. And today we're joined by yet another scientist who's turned out of the traditional academic career, even though, as we'll find out, she's still sort of in that universe. And today we're going to be talking to Dr. Kelley Remole, who is the Director of Neuroscience Outreach at Columbia University. Hi, Kelley. Welcome to Breaking Bio, and thanks for joining us today.
Hello. Thank you. My pleasure.
So do you want to tell everybody at home a little bit about who you are and what you do, and maybe how that's a little different than what you had set out to do, perhaps?
Absolutely. So there are many tangents in this story, but the most direct line from there to here would be tracking from a neuroscience PhD at Columbia to where I am now, which is sitting in a neuroscience research institute, not on the research side of things, but still in academia. So what I do is run outreach programs for the public, focusing on brain and brain science, communicating the wonders of the brain, as well as the scientific process as an inquiry, as a career, and basically use my love of science, my deep knowledge of the brain, and communicate that more widely.
So brain outreach and neuroscience outreach in New York is huge here now, but that wasn't, we were in grad school around the same time, but that wasn't so when we started grad school, so you were really at the forefront of these things. What was that like?
That is true. So when I was a grad student, which is, receding into my past now, but basically when I started graduate school, it was 2005, and I came into a program that was, very well respected, very academic focused, very research focused, not a lot of talk about alternative careers or even a way for someone to explore that career possibility, and I didn't, frankly. But I did come from college where I had done some sort of go be a scientist at a local school, and I really thought it was fun, and I thought it was something that I could contribute as I was getting my PhD, just get out of the lab, a couple times a year, talk to kids, just have fun with it. And I went to the program director at the time, and I said, is anyone doing this? And he said, no, go for it. So I started cold calling schools. I finally got someone's attention at a school in New York City, and we arranged a time for me to come. And for the first year or two, as I was working on my research, I would also once in a while go out to a school. I'd guilt my friends into joining me, and everyone had a really good time. It was kind of a way to blow off some steam from being in the lab for long hours, and a way to just express yourself in a different way while staying true to the science. So over the years, as I was getting my PhD, that interest, that sort of fun way to express myself, became more solidified as more and more people joined, and eventually I was able to formulate a more formal group, which still exists today, called Columbia University Neuroscience Outreach. And myself and the sort of core group of volunteers who started took that ethos of bringing science to a wider audience, and now we have gone on to do similar things in different respective universities, to head up different projects, sort of in a lot of different domains. So for example, now we have a project called Neuro Dome, and this is a planetarium show about the brain, and I never thought I'd be involved in a planetarium show about the brain, but it's an example of something that didn't exist before, but that background, that sort of marriage between education and science has made that possible.
So where along the track of your graduate school, like which year did you sort of start to think, like, I might not do a postdoc and I might want to do something else?
Maybe midway through, I started thinking, as I started to understand better what an academic career looked like, what the grind was for grants, and what the stress of taking care of my own research budget as well as that of my lab eventually, a number of factors sort of coalesced, and I said, that's not really what would make me get out of bed in the morning. It just doesn't fit my personality. But what I do like doing is working with people and pushing the envelope and having some freedom to think about how can I make this science, how can I take a big picture and make this science available to a lot of people. So at first I thought the way I wanted to do that was to go into journal editing. So I started networking in that field, and I did a small internship at the New York Academy of Sciences working in their Annals division, just to get a feel for the area. And then I stopped doing that about 9 months before I was set to defend my thesis, and I told my boss at the time, look, I have to dial back. I need to really focus on finishing here with an eye on my defense. And shortly after that, I was forwarded a posting from a friend of mine who knew that I liked outreach, who knew that I was interested in brain education, and the American Museum of Natural History was hiring a brain educator, a brain specialist. And I was like, who wouldn't want the title of a brain specialist? So I applied, and with my background in bringing science to children and doing this at different levels with different audiences, I was hired as their brain specialist, where I worked with their professional educators who were designing programs around a temporary exhibit that focused on the brain. So my background communicating science as well as my content expertise led me to this new world, really, of museum education, where I saw how scientists were working on the front lines of education as professionals with both a science and education background, and I had never known this existed, and it was really exciting to me to see this. So around that, again, when I had said no to something else, something else came up. I couldn't say no to the Natural History Museum, and so I balanced basically these two jobs while I was finishing my PhD. And around that same time, a new research institute here at Columbia called the Mortimer B. Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute was getting off the ground, and this institute has a commitment to public education. So with my background merging the science and the education angles, I sort of started to get a sense. I was invited in to talk about my work, to learn about what was going on, which was very little at the time, and to see if I would be interested in starting to get these programs off the ground. And that's where I started in what is now my job now, where I do education about 50% of the time, and then a growing segment of my job is actually on some of the internal programs of the Institute. We're very young. We haven't even moved into our new building, so it's really an exciting time to start to put my stamp on things and to think about how my skills can accelerate both education objectives as well as faculty development and research objectives.
So you just mentioned these internal programs. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
So very, very new. So there's not a whole lot to tell you at this time because they're very much under development. But I can say that some of the objectives are to find ways to make scientists more productive. So we'll be hiring what we're calling a grant strategist, a job that just posted recently, to someone who knows the science and knows the writing angle. And so that would be part of my purview, would be to support that person and then also instigate different programs that, for example, would teach postdocs how to write better, give guidance to junior faculty, that sort of thing. And then also internally working with the senior faculty on governance issues, so that because it's all faculty, it's self-governed, but making sure that governance happens and that it's executed will be part of my area.
That is a lot. That is a lot to take on, especially in the final year when you're trying to cut back and end up expanding everything out beyond all measure. Not really sure that's how things work, but it turned out well in the end. So who am I to critique anything? So I'm going to jump back to the AMNH. So what were you doing? Maybe, well, me in particular, but maybe a lot of other people when they hear talking about the American Museum of Natural History, they don't necessarily think of the medical side or the neuroscience side of that, and somebody specifically talking about the brain at the museum. We tend to think of the dinosaur bones and the big dioramas of elephants, but not necessarily some of the other human sides of things. So what were you going to be doing there until opportunity number 3 or 4 came along?
So it's exactly because we don't think of the brain, because AMNH doesn't have a focus on the medical sciences, that they needed an outside consultant. That's not their usual mode of operation. Usually they have internal educators who are specialists in ecology and other domains like evolution, where that background is known to them, where they have that internal expertise to design new exhibits and to design education programs that run alongside of it. because they didn't have that internal expertise, they sought outside guidance, and that's where I came in. So you're right, it's not what's typically thought of, but I'm happy to say that some of the programs and the interactive that I designed during my time there continue to live in the education, one of the education centers there, to be used by the public. So that because of the way the exhibit was funded, and because of what I built there, some of those things still last today, and it's been a few years, I'd have to think, maybe 4 years since the exhibit actually moved on from the Natural History Museum.
Yeah, so the museum here in New York City has education programs for kids of all ages and also adults. So I think that's like not that common for museums to have that. So you did teach some of those, right? Did you teach, or did you help with the plans for teaching?
So both. I was based in their DNA lab, lab for evolutionary biology, focusing on genetics of evolution. And so within that context, I taught high school students as well as adults taking classes. And you're right, the span of educational opportunities at AMNH is huge. And so I was working with different groups and saying, okay, well, this room focuses on the 4 to 8-year-olds, and they're exploring science in new ways. And so I was able to work with their educators and say, well, here's some content, and let's think about how we can make it interactive. So it was really expanding how I had thought about brain science before, to think about how it was a 5-year-old going to appreciate it, but a lot of fun at the same time.
So how do you actually go about doing this? Because often as scientists, we're not really taught to communicate our science to people of all these different ranges of ages and experience. Yep. So how did you work on that?
It was trial and error. It was working with a lot of people who did have an education background specifically. I think I, in some ways, benefited from, like what Heidi said, there wasn't a lot of people in New York doing this at the time, so I could put myself in the forefront and say, look, I'm one of the only people doing this, so let's work together and see what we can develop. There's always a sort of first mover advantage, no matter what field you're in, and I've definitely sort of ridden this tidal wave, or I like to think also pushed it forward, and have been able to put myself out there. So one experience begets another until I can kind of see a lot of things build. But just like as a general point to make to your audience, I think that one recurring theme throughout my career experience, and I think that is applicable to others, is that I have a history of seeking new opportunities and not just waiting for them to come, but for making them. So to say, at the Natural History Museum, my job description was one thing, but I was constantly pushing the envelope and seeing needs and then finding ways to fill them. So even if my job description was design a few things that would fit in one education lab, I would say, well, look, let's also do it this way. How are we going to make this better? And then within my job at Columbia, my purview was within education, but I had a lot of leeway to say, well, I see an opportunity here, so let's go in this direction.
So you bring up a really good point about the self-starting and going through and making opportunities for yourself and pushing the boundaries. And I'm curious whether that's something that grad school kind of taught you to do, whether that's a skill that you developed on your own, and whether you have any advice for people for working on that sort of thing as they're looking at different career options.
There are definitely a lot of skills that I learned in graduate school that are applicable that I still use today. That self-starting attitude of being a graduate student, and you have a prescribed project, but you're also typically tasked with seeing new results and taking them down a path and sort of using that instinct to say, well, where is this going to lead, and how would these results tie into a bigger picture? And I definitely do that today. Additionally, just that self-starting ethos of, there's no one breathing down my back to say this is what you have to do, but at the same time I'm getting things done and pushing the envelope.
Sweet, that's really good. So I'm going to jump into the Neuro Dome sphere, kind of like the Thunderdome, but less dangerous, I assume. So it sounds like this is the planetary thing where you have the big globe overhead, everybody's leaned back, hopefully not on any foreign substances, and are paying attention to the laser light show, and instead of stars and celestial bodies, we're talking about the human body. Is this correct?
Yes, this is an immersive experience designed by Jonathan Fisher, who is a astrophysicist turned neuroscientist, and it's a journey through your brain. So we're taking real data, putting it into a 3D rendering that is projected into a dome format, so planetarium. So you're reclined, you're laying back, it's a dark room, and you're literally flying through the brain. We have about a 10-minute sequence so far that we show to a lot of people, and it's an incredible feeling when one of my favorite parts of it, and there are many, is at the very beginning when we have data from a skull. Let's see, I believe it's the CT scan, and you fly through the eye socket and you end up inside the skull, and the skull is literally around you in this dome, and you feel like you're inside the skull, and then the skull fades away and it's replaced with the gray matter of the brain, and you really get this physical feel for how the brain fits inside the skull. And then we take other data and start basically swooping around the brain, and we tell a story about where things happen in the brain, the importance of different areas from the brainstem up to the cortex, and then we zoom in into a tiny, tiny piece of the cortex, and we start looking at the structure that I don't remember right now what kind of stain it was, but looking at the neurons in this, it's like you're in a forest of neurons. You really feel dendrites for what they are, basically dendrite being named after branches of a tree. So it's this incredible experience, and it takes someone who is a complete novice of neuroscience and gives them a sense of how exciting the brain is.
Cool. It's not often you get to actually see inside somebody else's mind, so I guess that's a tagline that I'm sure you guys are reaching.
When is that going to be ready?
So we show it now at various venues, educational venues, and we have plans for expansion.
That's super cool.
Awesome.
So you can go to neurodome.org and sign up for alerts of when Neuro Dome may be near you.
Sweet. That's really cool.
That's really crazy. So I also I try to ask everyone, do you ever miss it? Do you ever, see the people from your cohort from graduate school and think, like, what if, or what parts do you miss about it?
That's a great question. I think there are things I miss about childhood, but I wouldn't want to go back to it being a child, right? And there are things about the lab that I miss in terms of that physical sense of a really well-run gel, or the physicalness of pipetting or making a set of tissue look really nice, and that's under the microscope, and you feel that sense of accomplishment. And what I do now is much less tangible, in terms of I don't have a slide box with 100 slides all lined up neatly where I can start to see my data come alive. But instead I have real tangible things that are affecting people. So to say that I oversee a program where 14 high school students a summer come in and do mentored research in neuroscience labs across Columbia, I watch those kids come into their own as scientists and gain these skills that real scientists are using in the lab, and have that exposure that's going to stay with them for a lifetime. And that's a sense of accomplishment that I could never replicate in a lab, and that just kind of fulfills me in a different way. So there's a give and take, right? No experience is going to replicate that of an academic scientist, but I think there are other ways that I also see fulfillment. I think that having seen my cohort go through being graduate students and now moving on to postdocs, I can celebrate their successes in a way that I would never be able to if I was just friends with them, but not outside of science. But I don't feel any regret, like, oh, what if that had been me? It's almost like I know what they're going through to get that, and I celebrate them and I support them in a very visceral way, but I actually don't miss it.
That's always good. So I think that brings us to another interesting component. So perhaps as grad students, we're down in the trenches, so to speak, in the labs doing the research, and the university is kind of functioning all around us, sometimes in mysterious ways. We know that some of the money from our grants goes to other places in the department or in the university, and is supposedly keeping the lights on and whatnot. But for a lot of the cases, we don't really know what's happening outside of the lab or above our supervisor's head. How's it been going from a grad student and then almost immediately turning into somebody in the administrative side of the department and taking on a role that grad students aren't maybe as exposed to as often in their tenureship?
There is a whole other world that I didn't know about when I was a graduate student. I think that is a true sentiment, and I think very few graduate students would have the opportunity to see that. So it's been a learning process, but I like to think that having been on the other side of the bench, so to speak, has given me insights that I can bring to the administration that wouldn't otherwise be represented. I know how hard it is. I know what students are going through. I know what scientists are doing to move science forward every single day. And that gives me a certain fire in my belly to make programs happen that are going to support scientists at every level. And through education programs, I also make every opportunity to align the objectives with not only the public education side, but also the scientist trainee side. So finding opportunities, meaningful opportunities for graduate students to volunteer in as much capacity as they have, whether that's skill-wise and as well as time-wise, to say, let's use your unique skill set and bring that to a wider audience. So having seen both sides of it, I think I'm in a unique position or an unusual position in that I can advocate for both.
Yeah, I guess, and also when grad students coming to you complaining, you're like, girl, you don't know. I did this as well. Yeah, you can definitely, it's a different kind of understanding to understand someone else's misery while in grad school.
I think graduate students have a lot to offer. I think when you are in the trenches, you get a very tunnel vision. But my advice as someone who has gone through, have seen the other side, even if I hadn't gone or given up or moved completely away from that academic career path, I think I would have benefited from the activities that I did outside of the lab. I was fortunate to find these opportunities that intersected with science, so I wasn't doing ballroom dancing or something, although I wish I could do that. Instead, I found an opportunity to use some of that unique knowledge that I was gaining and apply it in a different setting. And any way that a graduate student can do that while following their interests is just going to make you a happier person overall. And potentially, you never know, build into a career or a side project that will become very meaningful for you. So I do recommend that people step outside their comfort zone, do something that maybe they didn't think they would be good at or didn't think they could do, because in what I've seen, people are surprised at what they can accomplish. It's also related to that, I think graduate students tend to forget how unusual a PhD is and how much it means to someone who doesn't have one. So to go and say, I have a PhD in X, a lot of people don't see that as, oh, all you can do is sit at a bench or go into the field and collect data. They say, oh my God, you're a really smart person, so you must be able to do this, this, and this. And from my perspective, I think, well, no, maybe I'm a little smart, but I'm also just stubborn and I persevere and I outlast other people, and that's where what partly the skills that got me to where I am today. But those skills of perseverance and dedication and showing up every day, even when things get tough, is something that's valued in any sector.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We tend to, like being in the academic sector, you start thinking that all you can do is just the one thing that you're paid to, but there are so many skills, and like you were saying, being able to go out and do things like you did with the outreach work, then you do build up this amazing portfolio, but it's hard to sometimes keep track of what that actually consists of.
Absolutely. So I do recommend that anyone starting out really tries to document whatever they do. I wish I had done that better to some extent, but just write down everything you do, even if it seems completely inconsequential, because you never know how these pieces are going to fit together. So like I said, I had started a pretty significant tangent into thinking, well, I want to go into publishing, and so I was sort of documenting my successes there, only to find a couple years later that all of a sudden I was in something completely different. So you just never know where you'll end up.
Yeah. As we know here at Breaking Bio, tangents are a thing that happen and generally a thing that comes out pretty well by the end of it. As speaking as someone who has more tangents in their PhD than core work as well at times. So. Hopefully some of those will pay off eventually. And so you talked about early on in our interview here that you were doing some work in schools, and I think this is the Brains in the City program where you were taking physical brains into classrooms and showing kids what was doing their thinking for them. What sort of experience was that like? Because I imagine for a lot of kids, having a real brain in like the classroom is something that is pretty new to them, and I would imagine is a pretty eye-opening experience in many ways.
Definitely, that's always a highlight, and I would say it's not just unusual for kids, it's unusual for adults, and in fact, holding a real human brain is actually unusual for even a neuroscientist, especially basic researchers who focus on a very specific field, don't, as a matter of course, have access to human cadavers, but because of, I mean, even that is that access that I had was serendipitous, and that I was teaching neuroanatomy in the medical school, where I was a TA for a course, and as part of that, part of my responsibilities were maintaining the human brains. And so because of that, I could go to these classrooms and be like, oh yeah, I could just grab a human brain on my way out and bring that. Right? And
totally normal thing to do.
Totally normal, you know. And then I'd get to the subway and be like, oh, I forgot my brains, right? And I'd run back and get them. So plenty of fun material there. So that became really a highlight, like you alluded to, and it really makes the science come alive. So we would always build in a lesson about what is it to be a scientist, what do scientists do, here's a little piece of what your brain does, and here are some real brains, and we bring a human brain. And then over the years we started building a brain library or a brain bank that we could draw from to start doing some comparative anatomy lessons. And these are just physical manifestations of questions that scientists approach as neuroscientists, and obviously it just makes the science come alive, and it made our visits a big hit.
I can imagine.
Yeah. I remember I had a friend who teaches and was coming up to get, and she's like, oh, I had to get a brain from there. I was like, oh, what kind did you get? Right, I dissected a sheep brain, pig's brain, rat, mouse, tons of frogs. And I was like, what do you got? She's like, human. I was like, you have a human brain? Like, how is that okay? How are you on the subway with human remains? Like, that seems wrong, but yeah.
I first started doing these visits shortly, it was just a few years after 9/11, and so there would be once in a while some big scares in the subway, and or just all over the city, and they'd increase the police presence in the subway, and people were subject to random searches just going into the subway. You might be stopped at any time, and people would investigate your bag, and I was like, okay, rule number 1, we do not take the brains on the subway because I don't want to explain that. And so our brains only get transported by car.
Yeah, that's a pretty quick way to make the serial killer list, I suspect.
Right? Like, scientists are suspicious enough.
Right.
Yeah, brain in a bag on the subway. That's
right.
That'll make the news for sure. Rat with pizza, brain in a bag, totally the same thing.
Exactly. Not the kind of exposure we wanted for our programs.
Yeah, no. No, any news is good news thing, not so much in this case.
Yeah. This is a really good point, because we always talk about this like leaky pipeline thing and leaving science. But most people that we've had on, especially that we've had on the show for these alternative careers, they haven't left science. They've just left this tiny little track of things. But, they've gone out and done really cool stuff and taken, their training or their, and their other interests and passions and really done something amazing with it. It seems like that's exactly what you've done.
I feel very fortunate that, things have aligned, or that, you can look at it 2 ways. Either my stars have aligned or I made my stars align. But I think it's both. And I'm incredibly grateful for my job. I find a lot of fulfillment in it, and I don't think that it's impossible that I would have this job if I didn't have that scientific background and that those credentials. But at the same time, I feel like I've been able to expand my offerings and my skills in a very meaningful way. So I think to only consider an academic track is fairly limiting. I think that should absolutely be a goal for many people, but it shouldn't be the goal for everyone. I think there's a lot to add in terms of that scientific knowledge and bringing that to other fields. So keeping, just the fact that you guys are doing this podcast, and that this podcast is focused on alternative careers, I think both are very important.
Cool. So we're pretty much out of time. We're getting right to the end of it. But we've been having people do throughout this Alt-October thing that we're doing is those that have made the jump successfully and are happy in their new careers outside of the traditional or the old school way, I guess, of doing things, is to maybe share a piece or two of advice to those that may be thinking about making a jump, thinking about stepping outside of the safe haven that is the lab, and provide a little bit of advice for how to make that transition or that jump successful. So what would you, if somebody were to come up to you and say, I'm thinking about getting out of the lab and doing something else related to science, what would you give them some advice to do?
Let me think. Figure out what you're interested in and go after it. I think that people figure out what they're going to do for a PhD, asking themselves that exact question, and they shouldn't think that that's the last time in their life they're going to ask that question. So what am I interested in and how am I going to do it is something that should drive you for the rest of your life. And so midway through your PhD is a good time to start making sure you're asking yourself that question regularly. And as you go, even if you're at a postdoc, as you're moving through a postdoc, it's a good time to ask yourself, am I doing what I'm really good at and what I get a lot of fulfillment fulfillment from? I think that would be something internal, and then something external in terms of what would others see in you. It's these transferable skills which people, these career sites talk about ad nauseum. It is true, so I will say it again and add to that, that the skills that make you successful as a graduate student are the same skills that are going to make you successful in just about anything that you approach. And when I say successful, I don't mean just how many grants did you get or did your experiments turn out the way you wanted them to, but rather that perseverance, the organization level, the ability to work both without direction and with direction, and on a time scale that is meaningful. All of these are just so important. And so you shouldn't apologize to yourself or to anyone else for thinking beyond the sphere of an academic career, but actually say, look, these skills make me unique. This specific mix-up makes me a unique candidate, and I can bring that to many other domains.
Sweet. That's really good advice.
Yeah, that's good advice. I mean, we forget sometimes, right? Like, people say a PhD will break your soul, and part of getting a PhD is surviving, right? Like, we are survivors, and right? There is a lot of perseverance and hard work, and broken souls, and but it's fantastic.
Well, and it's true. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you go and do the next experiment. And at the at the next career stage, you pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and you say, what's next?
So I think that's as good a spot to end it as any. So where can people follow along with what's next for you online?
So my LinkedIn profile is being updated sporadically as my job has increased. That's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
And then you also tweet for the brain stuff.
I do, although I'm not as, I look up to you guys who really create an online persona. I just dabble, but I am reachable through Twitter at the handle @NotJustBrainSci.
Sweet.
Awesome.
And we'll be sure to post links to both Kelley's LinkedIn as well as her Twitter account and all the other things like we've talked about this hour, like Neuro Dome and the Brains in the City program and all that stuff on our website, which is at breakingbio.com. And you can get in touch with us, like Kelley said, on Twitter at BreakingBio. You can find us on Facebook and join the discussion there by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast. And as always, if you wanted to leave a comment or a rating or anything like that at iTunes or Stitcher, that would be awesome for us. We need to thank the European Society for Evolutionary Biology for helping us bring the internet to you. And I hope everybody will join in with their own stories for Alt October throughout the month and beyond if you want, and help share what an alternate career has done for you or what you hope to get out of an alternate career. So hit us up there with the hashtag AltOctober. Thanks again, Kelley. That was a really great discussion, and hopefully everybody at home will join us next week when we have a new guest.